Buttons Moynihan. Buttons Moynihan says, "Do we understand the psych driving Weiss mid-class people, maybe white
White.
middle-class people, toward an ideology that tells them that they're scum of the earth? Do we understand it completely? No. I think, do we understand facets of it? Maybe some. Maybe some. There is a lot of guilt. I think there's a lot of guilt that people have for I think a lot of people don't know why it is that they are in a better place than other people, and they feel guilty about that. But I think the big reason is virtue signaling. I think it makes them feel good to jump on a bandwagon and condemn themselves. And because religion has been, I won't say wiped out, but greatly diminished in terms of mainstream acceptable moral codes, they are looking for some way to prove their righteousness, and condemning your own behavior. It's kind of like struggle sessions in the Cultural Revolution, standing up and saying, like Robin DiAngelo, look at White Fragility, look at that book. She's like, I'm a racist. I do all these horrible things. We're all racist. Like, it's a way to virtue signal, to show that you're somehow you get brownie points because you're the one standing up pointing out this thing that should be difficult to point out because it's your own sins, right? Or it's you're targeting your own race. But I think
you are separating yourself from the pack. You're basically saying,
Yeah.
I'm one of the good oppressors.
Right.
Like,
Right.
and I think you're right, Carter, that there's something there about, obviously part of it is virtue signaling. You're doing that. You're saying, I'm one of the good ones, right? And how do you do that? You point at the bad ones. But I do also think there's a self-hating aspect to it. I do like the in the question, self-hating. It's some of these people are probably, we've said this before, but they probably do have racist beliefs or sexist beliefs. And it's easier, it's very comfortable for them to believe, to hear of an ideology that tells them, hey, all white people have racist beliefs, or hey, all men are sexist and have sexist beliefs. It's an inherent bias. That feels good because then you're sharing the guilt collectively with a whole group of people instead of personally owning what's wrong with you.
Yeah.
You know, and
No,
I
I think
also
you're spot
think,
on. Yeah.
yeah, like last night on the Comics Division show, they were talking about briefly about Mark Ruffalo. Mark, my ex-husband used to call him Mark Duffalo. Somebody said they don't think they think he's disingenuous, and I actually don't think he's disingenuous. I think Mark Ruffalo is a great example of someone who probably, he's been through a lot. I've read an article about some of his struggles. He probably has unresolved trauma, and social justice ideology functions in some ways like a religion. So it gives you this sense of salvation, of like, you've attained this thing, you are a good person, and it's a cheap way of feeling like you've worked through all those issues. And but it doesn't, it's empty. Ultimately it's empty. It doesn't have the concept of grace. That's another reason why I left it, is that it was my religion in a lot of ways for 2 decades, but it wasn't fulfilling. You're constantly doing penance. You're always in that place of being a sinner. And I mean, and you are in Christianity too, believe that humans are all sinners, but there's something got through in Christianity, for example, you have grace through God, not through yourself, not through your actions. They don't have a deity in social justice ideology. There's nothing that gives you this sense of grace or something there's no absolution. There's nothing to emulate and to work towards and to offer when you want to be your worst self, to offer guidance on how to be your best self. It's just all about cutting other people down. it's all about cutting other people down and projecting. And so I think it's ultimately empty. But yeah, I think psychologically people end up in it maybe sometimes because they have a lot of unresolved trauma or resentment about the world and about their state of being, because they feel like everything bad that's ever happened to them, they haven't dealt with it, and they want an outlet to point towards and say, this
It's
is why
easier
all
to
this bad stuff has
externalize
happened to me.
than introspect.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I don't know. When I zoom out on it, I think to myself, it's very likely that the psychology of the population in general today is not fundamentally that much different from the psychology of people 200 years ago in the sense of what our root desires and psychological issues are. There's probably some difference, but um, there is a very different cultural dynamic, and I imagine that contributing factors are the destruction of religion without replacing it with any sort of moral code that's focused on introspection and personal responsibility, which Christianity does have a personal responsibility component to it. At least most Christians believe that. Um, and there's a level of comfort, right? I mean, we're really, really comfortable. I know people are like they're suffering, and I get that, but rewind 200-300 years, you're a king. You're living like royalty. We are extremely comfortable, and you don't see social justice ideology take off. You don't see this virtue signaling social justice crap take off in cultures that are struggling with feeding themselves. And I'll pick
Because
on
they have,
China as an
yeah,
example. Um, there is, China is behind us in the sense that they are not fully developed as a nation. They're close, right? But they they had, first basically empires. Then they went through a long period of communism where millions of people died and mass starvation and brutal behavior. Um, and then they kind of became this, I'll say, pragmatic autocracy, which allowed certain freedoms and kind of allowed there to be a little bit of economic prosperity. And that was done precisely because there was a recognition that communism didn't work. And so they were like, well, we're going to do socialism with Chinese
right,
characteristics, right? Which is like
right.
not really socialism. It's a form of authoritarianism. But as a result, if you look at the last couple decades, you've seen a massive amount of wealth generated in China, but it's still not, maybe in the major cities they live as well or better than many of us do, but in a lot of parts of China they don't. And their mentality, they haven't been in the comfort zone for generations. Maybe a couple generations from now they will be, but they haven't been in the
Yeah,
comfort zone, the living the life in the lap of luxury as much as we have. And so they look at our social justice warriors, for example, and they think they're ridiculous, right? There's,
yeah.
I think that was a Baizo is the word, white person,
Biozo or
right?
something. Yeah,
Yeah. So like they look at us, and especially social justice warriors, and they're like, look at these, you know, these people living in utter comfort with high standards of living. They have no problems to speak of in the sense that, they'll be able to eat and they have shelter and like they have Netflix and like they have these lives that are so much cushier than most of the other population, and they're whining about microaggressions and
they're
whatever. Like
whining about, yeah,
it's like it's a joke to them. So I think if
from
we
from their couch while watching Netflix.
right,
You know,
right, and so I think I abs and I the sad part about this is I don't know how to solve it, but I think there is some truth to this sort of that old um, adage where it's like shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations or whatever it is, or that like boots to silk slippers to boots again, or whatever that
yeah,
analogy is, where like we get comfortable enough as a society and we lose. There's something that pushes us psychologically to just become very weak, and susceptible to this kind of stuff, and we end up destroying ourselves. And I don't know why exactly, but
it's
I think
that
that's something to
meme. What is
consider.
it about? how hard times produce
Mhm.
strong men produce good
Good
times
times
produce
produce weak men. Yep.
weak men produce
Yeah.
hard times.
Right. It's the same. It's that cycle, right?
Yeah.
Um, and Glubb talks about it in what is it? The crap. What's that little book that he wrote about? John Glubb wrote about uh, something about empires and the life of empires. I don't remember. Um, but yeah, he talks about the average lifespan being 250 years, and he for an empire, and he lays it out in terms of what the phases are, and the phases at the end become these, kind of bread and circuses kind of thing, where people are pretty comfortable relative to everyone around them, and that leads to weakness that is exploited either by internal or external forces that just want to take over and you know maybe maybe conquer it, or maybe just push the great reset button and start over, right? um I don't know. That's a question that I probably could think about before we answer more. I
You
don't know.
could, yeah,
Sorry.
but
Yeah.
you're thinking while talking. It's okay. It's a long answer. I like that question. Thanks.
It's a tough question, and it's a good question to ask. And I'm not a psychologist, so but it's a great question. Actually, Coddling of the American Mind is good to read if you'd like to understand some of the psychology behind how people are ending up this way on like a less broad scale than we were just talking, but on a more, what are the concrete things that have happened in society recently to raise a generation of kids or adults that have this these proclivities, or this tendency to be social justice warriors. And that's also Jonathan Haidt, right? Coddling of the American Mind.
Yeah, that's Jonathan Haidt. Yeah,
Yeah. All
and
right.
Greg Lukoff.
Yes.